lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Megan Kassabaum, who will be speaking to us about the North American mounds as World Heritage. So she'll be speaking about the site of Cahokia, which is a World Heritage site in Illinois. I'm fascinated by what I've been learning about this. The 120 earthen mounds that she'll be discussing will be taking a closer look at how fascinating they are as examples of engineering and ingenuity. So Dr. Megan C. Kassabaum is the Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Weingarten Associate Curator for North America at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds degrees from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for her doctorate, and Beloit College. Her research interests are the archaeology of the American Southeast, prehistoric archaeology of the woodland period, the Native South, monument construction and communal ritual, food and feasting, ceramic technology, and public and museum archaeology. Her current publications include the recent A Text on Elevated Ground, The History of Platform and Mound Construction in Eastern North America, that's from the University of Florida Press just this year, and Reconceptualizing the Feast, Interpreting Communal Consumption in the Archaeological Record. You can find that in American Antiquity. So before I turn it over to Dr. Kassabaum, I just want to remind our guests that are on site today that after the lecture, if you have a question, to come up to the microphone so the rest of the guests online can hear you as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kassabaum.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I want to give a special thank you to all of you who are here in person. I know there's a lot of people online, and I'm very excited to see you as well and to hear your questions at the end. But particularly for those of you that are here in this beautiful auditorium, we're really thrilled to have you, and we're glad that you could make it out to the Penn Museum. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about North American mounds, which is the focus of my research as an archaeologist, and also something that I've become really passionate about sharing with the rest of the world, people who don't live here in North America, and thinking of them as a form of world heritage, I think, is a really important way to do this. So as many of you probably know from attending other talks in this series, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, which is what I will be calling it for the rest of the talk, maintains a list of World Heritage Sites. And in total, the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites includes 1,155 monuments in 167 countries. So World Heritage Sites are cultural or natural, sometimes both, sites that are considered to be of, and I'll put this in quotes, outstanding universal value, which have been inscribed onto a list by vote by the World Heritage Committee. These places or buildings are thought to have special importance for everyone by transcending national boundaries and being of high value to both the current and future generations. They also have to represent unique, or at least the most significant or best examples of the world's cultural or natural heritage. So I just want to give you a few statistics about the World Heritage List. Europe is by far home to the majority of these sites, with the Asia Pacific coming in second, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Africa, and then the Arab states, and then finally North America. North America has the fewest World Heritage Sites with 42, and 24 of these are in the United States, which puts it about 12th on the list of number of sites per country. So of those 24, and I'll just pop this map up here so that you can sort of see where these are located, 12 of these, those are the ones in green, are sites of natural heritage. 11, the ones in yellow, are sites of cultural heritage. And then one over there in Hawaii is a site of both natural and cultural heritage. The one in red that you can see down there, that's the Everglades. That's the one site here in the United States that's marked as a heritage site in danger. So 6 of these, which I'll mark with stars here, are sites that are related to either Native American history or contemporary Native American culture. And as you can probably see from this map, the greatest concentration of these Native American World Heritage Sites is in the American Southwest, where the sites of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Taos Pueblo have all been inscribed on the UNESCO list. So I have pictures up here of these, but I want to tell you just a little bit about them, even though they won't be the focus of what I'm talking about tonight. So Mesa Verde, up in the top there, is in southwestern Colorado, and it was inscribed on the list in 1978. It was the first Native American site to be placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And this was due to the great concentration of ancestral Pueblo dwellings that were built there from the 6th to the 12th century AD. One of the things that makes this site most impressive is that these people were building these constructions at an altitude of more than 2,600 meters. Within the site of Mesa Verde, which is an amazing place to visit, archaeologists have recorded about 4,500 sites, and these include mesa top villages, and then perhaps most impressively, the one that I'm showing here, these imposing cliff dwellings that are built of stone and sometimes comprise of up to 100 rooms. If you see this site, you can wander through these rooms, climb up the various ladders that they have that allow you to explore them, but it really is a remarkable feat of engineering. The second site shown there, Chaco Canyon, is located in New Mexico, and it was inscribed on the list in 1987. The site served as a major urban center for ancestral Pueblo people between about 850 and 1250 AD, and it was a focus for all sorts of ceremonial activity, trade, and elaborate political action. The distinctive architecture of its monumental public and ceremonial buildings, which is what I'm showing you in this picture here, is what has made it particularly important and earned it a place on this UNESCO list. So one of the really interesting ones, and I want you to pay attention to this one because I'm going to come back to it at the very end, Taos Pueblo, which is also located in New Mexico and shown in that third picture, was inscribed on the list in 1992. Unlike the two archaeological sites that I just described, the culture in the community at Taos is active and thriving, but importantly, it shows many similarities to the settlement sites of the ancestral Pueblo people that are preserved at places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Taos has been continually inhabited since at least the late 13th century and remains a vibrant place of Pueblo culture today. So then, in addition to these sites in the Southwest, there's one other indigenous site in Hawaii that I just want to briefly mention. This is the place on our map that was inscribed as both a natural and a cultural heritage site. This was done in 2010. And it was done in recognition of the deep cosmological significance that holds for contemporary Native Hawaiian people as an ancestral environment, so a place that their ancestors lived, but also as a physical embodiment of the Hawaiian concept of kinship between people and nature, and as the place where Native Hawaiians believe that life originated and also where they believe that their spirits will return after death. So this is a really good example of a site that sort of spans both contemporary Hawaiian belief systems and has a lot of ancient archaeological remains as well. Okay, so that brings us to the only two Native American sites in the eastern United States to be inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. So you can see those two over here on this portion of the screen. I, of course, as someone who studies the eastern United States, really want you to see, that a lot of the sites in the eastern United States are cultural sites, but they relate to European heritage. A lot of the sites in the western United States are natural sites. And one of the points that I want to make tonight is sort of how important it is that we continue to add sites of importance to Native American populations to this list. So to begin that argument for you. Native American people likely first entered what is now the eastern United States around 18 or 20,000 years ago. So it's a really long time ago, and over many millennia, those initial groups eventually diversified into the many tribal groups with whom Europeans first made contact in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. So while the violence of the colonial encounter unquestionably reduced the numbers of indigenous people in North America dramatically, as places like the Taos Pueblo remind us, many Native American communities still thrive within what is now the United States. And that's something that I think is really important to remember as I talk about these ancient sites. The US federal government recognizes 574 individual Native American tribes, and that comprises a population of over 5 million people. In addition to these, there are 63 state-recognized tribes, and there are also many groups that claim indigenous ancestry but have no formal recognition from either a federal or state government. So archaeologists who study the ancestors of these contemporary groups have always found it useful to divide this long swath of time into a series of periods marked by major shifts in lifeways. So I have this little diagram up here just to make you familiar with these terms, and I'm mostly going to talk about the four that are at the top, really skipping over the first one. But just to give you a brief introduction, the Paleo-Indian period, the oldest period of occupation in what is now the US, is a period during which small mobile groups hunted large megafauna, things like mammoth and mastodon. They moved around the landscape frequently. The Archaic period is a period during which these groups began to settle down in certain areas and intensified their use of plants for food as the megafauna died out. They're, of course, still relying on animals like deer and fish and waterfowl, but they're also making really heavy use of plants. The woodland period is a period during which truly sedentary settlements developed. At this time, people develop ceramic technology, and they begin to experiment with growing their own food rather than using just what's available to them in the wild. And then the Mississippian period is a time period during which large population centers developed, and people came to rely really heavily on corn agriculture, along with squash and beans, what we all often think of as associated with contemporary native groups. So throughout the latter three periods that I just mentioned, the Archaic, the Woodland, and the Mississippian, Native American people didn't just live on the land. They fundamentally changed the landscape of what is now the US by constructing huge numbers of earthen mounds. And it's two of these mound sites that we're gonna spend most of our time tonight talking about. So just to give you an orientation, any of you who have seen me speak before have probably seen this map many times, but it's truly an incredible piece of sort of historical document here. It was created in 1894, and it marks the location of every Native American mound site that could be identified at that time. Now, undoubtedly, lots and lots of mounds had already been destroyed by 1894 and thus can't appear on this map. And at the same time, many more have since been discovered. But this map is basically the best visual representation I have to show you how full of Native American monumental architecture the landscape of the eastern United States was and still is. So just to highlight this for you, I'll zoom in on the part of the United States where I grew up. So this is sort of looking at Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana. And this is an area that has some of the highest concentrations of Native American mound sites, so particularly dense distribution. And I just want you to take a note of sort of how many dots are sort of plastered around all of these river valleys. And then keep in mind that some of them, including a site that's located right there where I just popped up the star here, some of those sites include many, many mounds. So this map is just showing you the sites, but the mounds multiply that number significantly. So where the star is located is the first of the two UNESCO World Heritage Sites that we're going to discuss today. And it's within this incredible concentration of sites just across the river from St. Louis in Illinois. And this is the site of Cahokia. So Cahokia comprised the largest pre-contact concentration of both people and monumental architecture north of Mexico. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. Now, archaeologists are still fighting about how many people lived at Cahokia. Some people say that it was probably home to as many as 50,000 people, and even the people who are the most conservative in their estimates believe that it was home to at least 20,000 people. It would have taken more than a day to walk from one corner of Cahokia to the other on foot, and at its peak, which is about from AD 1050 to 1200 during the Mississippian period, to use those terms that I just showed you, Cahokia was larger than the city of London. So the medieval city of London, this is the medieval period, but here in the United States, Cahokia was significantly bigger than London. So if you think about whether we, as people judging World Heritage, consider the medieval city of London to be a sort of nationally and internationally important site, I want you to be thinking about this site as a larger city than that. Perhaps even more impressively, it would have held the record for the most densely populated city in America up until the early 1800s, when the then burgeoning city of New York would have finally surpassed it. So again, when you're thinking about New York in the 1800s, does that count as a city and as a significant international city? Think about Cahokia in the same way. So Cahokia itself contained at least 120 mounds, 80 of which are still existing on what is now a state park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site that you are welcome to visit. The people who lived there were not only incredible engineers who built all of these constructions, but also truly incredible artisans who created beautiful objects out of stone, clay, shell, and copper. And I just have a few examples of those objects up on the slide right now. What I'm zoomed in on in this map is the ceremonial core of Cahokia, which spans about 16 square miles. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that the site extends at least 10 miles from this central core. But if I zoomed out to show you the entirety of that, you wouldn't get to see any of the sort of internal structure of the site. So part of what is protected today as the World Heritage Site consists of what archaeologists would refer to as a typical platform mound and plaza layout. This means that you've got mounds surrounding a big open space where we assume public activities occurred. In this case, you have 16 mounds surrounding a 46-acre plaza. This entire space was enclosed within a sizable palisade wall, so you can see this sort of wooden wall that goes around the outside here. And it is assumed that this was meant to protect the city's central precinct from outside attacks. The wooden palisade is over 2 miles long, and it would have required over 15,000 logs to construct. And of course, this is wood, which means those logs don't last forever, so they would have had to repeatedly fix and replace sections of this, requiring a massive amount of energy and effort. Many more mounds, numerous secondary plazas, and various other functional and ceremonial features sit outside of this central plaza, and while we don't have time for me to take you through all of them tonight, there are a few that I want to highlight and tell you about. So the largest mound at Cahokia, which is what you're looking at the top of this picture up here, is known as Monk's Mound. It dominates the central precinct from its position at the north end of the plaza, and it is by far the largest earthen construction in all of the Americas. The 100-foot tall platform, so just to put that in perspective, that's about the height of a 10-story building, consists of 5 separate terraces, and it was constructed starting around AD 1000. In its final stage, the upper terrace would have supported a building that was probably about 100 feet by 50 feet in dimension, and perhaps as much as 50 feet tall. So again, to put this in modern standards, with a building, a wooden building up there, we'd be looking at something that looks about like a 15-story building. The base of the mound, to make it even more impressive, covers roughly the area of 14 football fields. So it would have required Native people to move about 6 million basket loads of dirt in order to build this mound. And I want you, when you're thinking about the engineering prowess of these people, to remember that they're not working with pack animals and they're not working with metal tools, shovels, etc. They're digging this dirt by hand, using wooden tools. They're placing it in baskets that they'd woven by hand. They're putting those baskets on their back, and then they're walking to the top of a 100-foot structure to dump that basket out and then begin the whole process again. So this is really represents an absolutely amazing expenditure of effort and energy. To sort of hit this point home, I want to compare this to some more regularly discussed monuments, other things that sit on the World Heritage list that UNESCO holds, but are often talked about in a lot more detail in schools, especially in places outside the US, but even here. I mean, I learned about these places in school, even though I grew up just across the river from Cahokia. So Monk's Mound is, of course, not nearly as tall, as you can see from these numbers, but much larger at the base than both the Great Pyramid at Giza and the Temple of the Sun at Teotihuacan. While the height of these other monuments is certainly impressive, and I don't want to downplay that, it is really important to remember that Monk's Mound was built entirely of earth, and thus was not able to rely on the stacking properties of stone blocks. So in order to get this thing to be 100 feet tall, people really had to understand the way that soil works and understand how to control it. A great deal of research at Cahokia has focused on this soil. People have wanted to study the dirt with which these monuments were constructed in order to give us a sense of the truly incredible engineering abilities of the mound builders. So this picture on the side of the slide over here is a close-up view from excavations within Monk's Mound, within that big mound at the north end of the plaza. And it has shown that the surface of the mound was continually resurfaced with different colors of soil. So as soon as one would start to erode or fade, a new layer would be added, sometimes of a dramatically different color. So I know these are a little hard to see, but we've got red, black, white, gray, and brown layers sort of alternating in here. This observation, and similar observations at other sites, including another one that I'm going to talk about in a little while, has recently led some archaeologists to critique the way that we often imagine mounds to look. So due to the fact that most mound sites today are either on private land and wooded, or they're in public parks and covered with sort of nicely mowed grass, we often envision, and when we commission an artist to do a drawing of a site, we often envision it like this top picture here, sort of crisp, green, manicured landscapes. But if you really think about this, you remember the rather obvious fact that mound building populations would not have had lawnmowers, nor would they have had access to grazing animals like goats or anything that could have kept the vegetation down. So they really wouldn't have had any way of keeping the mounds from growing up in high shrubs and weeds. Rather, what we learn from excavations at sites like Cahokia is that their most effective method of keeping the mountain vegetation from getting out of control would have been to never let it start growing up in the first place. And it has thus been suggested that one of the reasons we see this repeated resurfacing of mounds was that the clay that they were using to do this would have kept the weeds from growing. And if this is true, then we as archaeologists, including depictions that we have here in the Penn Museum, need to really dramatically rethink the way that we depict mounds in artist interpretations. And when we do this, and this is just a photoshopped version of that slide, we end up seeing sites like these large Mississippian sites in the eastern United States that start looking much more like the Egyptian pyramids or the Mayan pyramids, and various other monumental places that we're much more used to learning about in schools, and frankly, which are much more well represented on UNESCO's World Heritage List. Okay, but it's not just the mounds. There are other ways that Cahokia also opens our eyes to similarities between North America's ancient sites and those more famous examples from other parts of the world. So for example, Cahokians, in addition to building all of the mounds, also constructed a giant solar calendar, which we refer to as Woodhenge. That probably sounds familiar, and it is not accidental that we're trying to make people think about Stonehenge by calling it that. This enormous wooden circle was rebuilt at least 4 times using 48 massive cedar posts. The monument is 410 feet in diameter and clearly demonstrates the degree to which Cahokians understood not just the land and the engineering properties of their soil, but also the celestial sphere, especially the movements of the sun. So much like Stonehenge in England, if you stand at Woodhenge's center post and you look out at all of these perimeter posts, you can watch the sun rise and set at specific posts that would mark when each of the important events for Cahokians were happening. We know that they marked things like the solstices and the equinoxes. We know, perhaps most importantly, that on the fall equinox, the sun rises directly to the east over the edge of Monk's Mound, and visitors who have watched this phenomenon recently describe it as if they're looking at the mound giving birth to the sun. In addition, though, to marking these important astronomical dates that we still recognize as important today, we assume that Woodhenge would also have been used to determine things like when to plant and harvest various crops and when to gather for important ceremonies. Based on the materials that are found at Cahokia, we know that some people traveled up to 500 miles to attend ceremonies at the site, and many of these special occasions would have probably surrounded important astronomical events being marked by Woodhenge. So while Cahokia itself is undoubtedly incredibly impressive, and this is why it was deemed by UNESCO as having outstanding universal value, I think it's really equally important to note that the nearby sites that are now under the cities of St. Louis and East St. Louis would have contained at least 60 more mounds and been home to many more people. These 2 other major pre-contact sites have been almost entirely destroyed. These images, which I always find to be just kind of horrifying to look at, document the purposeful destruction of the big mound at the St. Louis Mound Group in 1869. So in the 1840s and 1850s, St. Louis began to grow rapidly, and the decision was made that this big pile of dirt was basically in the way of the urban expansion of the city. So they made the choice to level the big mound. The dirt and clay from the mound was used as backfill to fill in the swales that the city was set on, and also to make brick for all of the buildings. Sadly, very little, if any, archaeological work was done during its demolition or during the demolition of all of the surrounding mounds. One mound in the St. Louis Mound Group still exists. It's now owned by the Osage Nation. However, we also do know from both historic maps and records, as well as more recent archaeology, that the St. Louis and East St. Louis mound sites were impressive settlements that, had they survived, would likely have been included in the UNESCO World Heritage Site today. They would have been part of Cahokia. So hopefully, as you can see from this map, we've got Cahokia here, we've got East St. Louis down here, and we've got St. Louis over here. But even between those 3 major cities, there are a large number of small sites with just 1 or a few mounds that connect Cahokia to those 2 major centers to its west. And I think about this as basically a suburban landscape of sprawling communities connecting a few major Native American cities. So again, this starts to make it sound a lot more like the types of cities that we live in today than you might think when you visit Cahokia in its sort of green mode state. So all of these smaller sites that are connecting these centers are really only visible to us as archaeologists through these small windows of excavation that are required as part of federal highway and bridge projects. So just as an example, the recent placement of a new bridge over the Mississippi River uncovered the remnants of more than 1,000 prehistoric houses at the base of an earthen pyramid, giving just a small hint into what's buried under the industrial districts that surround St. Louis in both Missouri and Illinois. The more of this that we excavate, the more we realize that this landscape was truly just packed with people. So importantly, the Mississippian culture of which Cahokia is a part was widespread across the American South and Midwest, and a huge number of mound sites were constructed. This map just shows the major towns and mound centers, but it does not even begin to represent the entirety of Mississippian society. And many of the sites marked on this map would frankly make entirely appropriate additions to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites as well. So just for the sake of comparison, there are 10 monumental Mayan sites on the list, but only 2 North American mound sites. So sites like Moundville in Alabama, which is at the top here, or Etowah in Georgia on the bottom, these are just 2 examples that are particularly spectacular and remain in good enough condition that I think they could be considered by UNESCO in the future. Okay, so I want to switch gears now and talk about the second mound site that has in fact been inscribed by UNESCO. And this is the site of Poverty Point in northeastern Louisiana. This was built and used during the end of the Archaic period. So we're moving you way back in time now to about 1600 to 1100 BC. Okay, so we've zoomed way back in time. We skipped over the whole woodland period in the middle, and we'll come back to that at the end. So the Poverty Point site consists of 1 really large mound, 5 smaller associated mounds, and then a series of 6 concentric earthen ridges that you can see here pictured with structures on top of them that surround a central open area or plaza. The site stretches for about 3 miles, making it the second largest Native American site prior to European contact, and frankly, much, much larger than anything contemporary to it. So just to make sure you can follow along with the timeframes here, we're talking about 2,000 years or more before Cahokia, nearly 3,000 years before Cahokia. So Poverty Point was officially listed as a World Heritage Site in 2014, making it one of the most recent additions. And I was a practicing archaeologist at the time that this was happening, so I'm very aware of how much work it took on the part of the state archaeologist and various other archaeologists in the state of Louisiana to get this site on the list. One little side note that I just wanted to show you for all of those music buffs out there in the audience, a really fun fact about Poverty Point is that its layout was actually used as the basis for the design of the Burning Man Festival. So that's shown on the left of the slide here, right next to Poverty Point on the right. So hopefully you can see the similarities here. There's a lot that we could say about this, about appropriation of Native American culture, et cetera. But the one thing that I do think it emphasizes is that this is a very functional way to take a bunch of people and focus their attention on one place. And so in much the same way that the Burning Man is at the center of Burning Man, it is easy to assume that a lot of really important things happen in the plaza at Poverty Point, and I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So the collections from Poverty Point contain some of the most beautiful and exquisitely made stone artifacts in the Americas, and these are just a few examples, including jasper and greenstone beads. To give you a sense of scale, because I think this is really important here, that owl bead that you can see right here, the owl bead is about the size of my thumbnail. So not only does it take an insane amount of skill to create these, I do want you to think about the fact that these are made entirely without metal tools, right? So they're making stone beads using other stone tools and wooden tools. And this certainly suggests the presence of specialized artisans. But just as importantly, the raw materials present at Poverty Point suggest an incredible amount of long-distance trade, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. So this, along with the sheer size of the site, differentiates it from anything that came before it and most things that came after it. Mound A at Poverty Point is the second largest earthen construction in the Americas, so just behind Monk's Mound at Cahokia, which you just learned about, and it stands about 70 feet tall. It covers an area equivalent to nearly 8 football fields. You can compare that to the 14 football fields of Monk's Mound. And it contains about 238,000 cubic meters of soil. So extensive recent archaeological work has been done at this site, and it has shown us that the Poverty Point mound builders were truly exceptional engineers. So not only did they manage to create a 70-foot tall structure out of dirt that has lasted nearly 4,000 years, but they also did so with highly developed and very specific techniques, including things like adding clay caps to help control erosion or to cover the mound in a certain color, just like they were doing at Cahokia. But also, my personal favorite, they built portions of the mound out of sod blocks that basically functioned as kind of a primitive version of Velcro. So they dug up sod and they put one face up and another one face down to make sure that the roots of the grass would actually hold that in place. And we know that they were using this at particular locations where they were facing issues with erosion. So they were really problem solving to make sure that this building remained sort of a permanent monument on the landscape. Perhaps even more impressively, recent work at the site has proven that the enormous mound A, so again, we're talking about a 70-foot tall monument, was built exceptionally rapidly. Based on about 90 small core holes and some minor excavations, one of the archaeologists who's dedicated his career to studying Poverty Point can now say with certainty that the mound was built with no major breaks in construction, not even a break long enough for it to rain on one of those temporary surfaces. So to put some numbers to this, and of course these numbers are a little squishy, but there's only ever been a single month on record in Louisiana where it didn't rain. So this probably means that Mound A was built in 30 days or less. So all of this means that a huge number of people would have been involved in mound construction at Poverty Point. And based on archaeological work done at the site, as well as contemporary sites elsewhere, we know a fair amount about the type of community that might have been involved. So in addition to its scale, complexity, and completeness, one of the primary reasons that the Poverty Point complex was recognized by UNESCO is because it was built entirely by mobile hunter, fisher, gatherers during that archaic period, rather than by a settled agricultural population like the one that constructed Cahokia and many other documented mound sites. We don't even believe that these people lived at Poverty Point permanently, but rather that they probably gathered at the site to undertake communal activities that revolved around things like mound building, but also trade and craft production. So we're still learning more about Poverty Point every year, and I want to share with you some really recent results that were just published in 2022. So this map of the site was published in 2022, and it highlights the fact that Poverty Point's C-shaped ridges encircle a 43-acre plaza in which a lot of important stuff happened. So compared to the earthen architecture that surrounds it, the relatively flat plaza is not immediately impressive when you visit the site. However, recent investigations have revealed evidence that the plaza itself is a remarkable, complex, constructed feature. Archaeologists often think about plazas as kind of empty spaces, so places where social activities may have taken place, but very few constructed features were ever built. But from Poverty Point, we know that large areas of the original ground surface in the plaza are missing, likely stripped away purposefully with the goal of creating that big flat open space in which those activities could take place. In other areas, people added up to a meter of fill to level and raise low spots in the natural ground surface. So a lot of work went into constructing the plaza as well. But perhaps even more excitingly, a number of geophysical surveys, so work that's been done from the surface of the site, looking underground using various instruments rather than excavation, have managed to map the traces of timber circles beneath and within the plaza fill. So the picture that you're looking at on this side of the slide over here, these dark things that you're seeing here are those big post circles as they show up in the geophysical survey. And then in the plaza here, you can see a map made of all of the circles that have been identified so far. Excavations on a few of just a very small number of these circles have revealed that they were consisting of posts that were set and then at some point purposefully removed, the holes refilled with new soil, and then new posts placed, often in roughly the same area. In total, the archaeologists working at Poverty Point have identified 36 of these timber circles, and radiocarbon dates suggest that the construction and deconstruction and then reconstruction of them was a really long-standing tradition at the site spanning hundreds of years. Interestingly, at this point, we don't yet know their purpose. So hopefully our discussion up until this point of Cahokia and Poverty Point has demonstrated the incredibly long and complex history of mound building that occurred across North America in the millennia prior to European contact. Cahokia's importance was recognized by UNESCO in the 1980s, allowing Mississippian period mound building traditions to gain a prominence in discussions of monumental architecture worldwide. The inscription of Poverty Point onto the World Heritage List in 2014 means that there is now also an example of archaic period mound building on the list. But a huge number of mounds were constructed during the woodland period as well, mounds that represent wholly different traditions. And archaeologists today are working hard to get examples of these monumental places to be recognized by UNESCO as well. So before we finish up tonight, I want to take some time to tell you about a suite of sites that are currently on the United States UNESCO tentative list. So a tentative list is an inventory of those properties which each country intends to consider for a nomination in the coming years, but hasn't yet completed all the work necessary for that nomination to go forward. So archaeologists in Ohio are very busy, and I mean very, very, very busy, working on a nomination that includes 9 archaeological sites of monumental earthworks constructed by the Hopewell culture during this woodland period, so around the first millennium AD. These sites are ceremonial centers characterized by large earthwork constructions that feature precise geometric shapes and almost perfect standard units of measure. Including in this nomination are all 5 of the sites that I have up here right now. There's actually 6 up there, I realize. This one is gonna probably not make it onto the final nomination. 3 of these sites, Mound City, Hopewell, and Sipe, now make up the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, and they contain large ceremonial mounds. Excavations in these mounds that contain a wide variety of numerous finely crafted objects, many of which are made of materials from really far afield regions, places like the Great Lakes, the Great Basin, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Yellowstone Basin, and even the Caribbean. Hopewell and Mound City are large burial complexes surrounded by these irregularly shaped earthen walls. So just to give you a sense of scale, the outer walls of the Hopewell site, which is the one up here in the top corner, enclose an area larger than 100 football fields. The combined earthworks at the site would contain 3 sites the size of the Taj Mahal and all of its gardens. So again, trying to compare this to some of the other World Heritage sites. Hopeton, High Bank, and Sipe all represent variations on a much more precise type of geometric earthwork. Hopeton features a circle and a square. High Bank includes a circle and an octagon, and very likely had several important astronomical alignments, just like Woodhenge. And then Hopeton and High Bank all feature these long parallel walls that connect the large earthworks to smaller features or to rivers. Also included in this tentative nomination are the Newark earthworks. Newark has an elaborate site layout, including a variety of large earthen embankments in the shapes of circles and a geometrically perfect octagon, as well as a variety of small circular monuments, small conical burial mounds, and long, narrow causeways. So again, to give you a sense of scale, the longest causeway that you can see here on this is about 2.5 miles. One of the most amazing things about the Newark earthworks, and the reason that they're included in the nomination, is that they form an elaborate lunar calendar that is about twice as precise as the complex at Stonehenge. Scholars have demonstrated that the octagon itself comprises a lunar observatory designed to track the motions of the moon, focusing specifically on marking the northernmost point of the 18.6-year cycle of the lunar orbit. At that time, the moon rises within 1/2 degree, so really, really close, of the octagon's exact center when viewed from a small observatory platform mound. So as shown in this diagram, and I'm not going to get into the details here, many other alignments relating to the range of moonrise and moonset locations have also been recognized. Not to mention that there are likely many alignments that have not even been dreamed up by today's archaeoastronomers because they're not astronomical events to which we necessarily assign particular importance today, such as the rising and the setting of certain stars or constellations that might have been meaningful to native people but no longer hold a lot of meaning to Western populations. So the final site included in this tentative nomination is the Fort Ancient site. This is a 766-acre site located between Cincinnati and Dayton in Ohio and situated on a ridge above the Little Miami River. It contains the most well-preserved walls and mounds of one type of Hopewell earthworks that's not represented in the group that I just talked to you about, the hilltop enclosure. So in this case, the Fort Ancient site has 20,000 feet of walls that represent the best preserved of the Ohio Hopewell earthworks and enclose over 123 acres. The site also features typical Hopewellian characteristics such as mounds, parallel walls, and the division between interior enclosures. This is another site that you can go visit. You can walk along these walls and really get a sense of the scale. So together, these earthworks are the best preserved examples of the probably 40 to 60 well-known monumental earthworks constructed by the Ohio Hopewell culture during the woodland period. Many others are known today from historical records. This is a map from the 1800s that documents a lot of sites that no longer exist today. Some of these are entirely destroyed or not in good enough condition to be included in the nomination. And then the right side of the slide over here shows work that's been done on 2 examples of sites that are no longer visible on the surface, but have been identified using those same geophysical survey techniques that were used at Poverty Point to identify the big circles. So here's a small sort of rectangular structure here. And then this one I think is particularly amazing. These are all actually mowed into the grass by the landowner to make sure that people can get a sense of what this looks like, even though the earthworks themselves are too low to be visible to the naked eye anymore. So regardless of the fact that modern development has destroyed some of these amazing sites, the earthen walls constructed by Hopewell people are among the largest earthworks in the world that are not fortifications or defensive structures. Their scale is imposing by literally any standard, no matter what UNESCO World Heritage site you compare it to. So for example, 4 structures the size of the Colosseum of Rome would fit in the octagon at Newark, and the circle of the monoliths at Stonehenge would fit into any one of the nearly 200 tiny auxiliary earthwork circles adjacent to these large structures. Moreover, the presence of artifacts from far distant sources, especially materials that were not widely traded 2,000 years ago, indicates that these sites were important ceremonial centers that interacted with communities throughout much of Eastern North America and probably created very important connections between societies. Okay, so this brings us to our final site of the night, another type of earthwork that sits on the US's tentative list. Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is the largest documented surviving example of a prehistoric effigy mound in the world. So by effigy mound, we just mean something that is designed to look like an animal or some other creature. In this case, it's a sinuous earthen embankment about 411 meters long that includes an oval embankment at one end, which has been variously interpreted by archaeologists as a representation of the serpent's eye, as part of its head, or as a secondary object such as an egg that is being grasped in the serpent's open jaws. This monumental geoglyph embodies fundamental cosmological principles of ancient Native American culture. But one challenge to the inscription of Serpent Mound onto the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites is the fact that archaeologists are still actively debating its age. So radiocarbon dates obtained from samples of the fill from the effigy itself, combined with stylistic analyses of the iconography of the snake, as well as some of the pottery at the site, indicate to some that Serpent Mound was probably built by Mississippian people around the year 1000 to 1200. Others, based on totally different lines of evidence, contend that it was built in the much earlier period, during the woodland period, around the same time as all of those Hopewell earthworks that we were just looking at. Now, this type of ongoing debate to an archaeologist is really interesting, and it's one of the things that makes Serpent Mound so fascinating, but it can only be settled with additional research, and until it is settled, it is unlikely that Serpent Mound will be added to this list. Importantly, however, and here we're turning towards the portion of the talk where I tell you about what sites I think should be on the UNESCO World Heritage Sites list, even if they aren't currently being nominated by the United States. It's really important to envision Serpent Mound as just one of very, very, very many effigy mounds that were constructed in the northern Midwest during the woodland period. So if I were to add a mound site to the US's tentative list, I would focus my attention on these. Starting about 8600, just after the collapse of the Hopewell civilization, the effigy mound builders built an absolutely huge number of mounds in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. Many of these mounds took on animal shapes, so they're effigy mounds, including but certainly not limited to birds, bears, panthers, lizards, turtles, and humans. We've been able to estimate, including from that early map that I showed you from the 1800s that showed the locations of all of these mounds, that there were probably over 20,000 mounds constructed by the effigy mound builders. And about 4,000 of those still exist today in small parks all across the northern Midwest. The greatest number of them are preserved at Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa. Overall, that park preserves 206 mounds and a few large clusters. The largest cluster includes at least 112 mounds along the banks of the Mississippi River. So again, that puts it about on par with Cahokia, though the mounds are not nearly as large. And this represents the largest group of mounds in one location in North America that are still extant. The second largest cluster, pictured here, these are actually outlined in white chalk just to make them easier to see for an aerial photograph. This is commonly referred to as the Marching Bears Monument and was constructed along a high ridge overlooking the Mississippi River. So these effigy mounds are only a few feet high when you walk up to them, but the quantity that were constructed and their elaborate shapes and alignments that are now clearly recognizable from the air make them quite stunning. It's likely that the mounds, which are often arranged in clusters emphasizing a certain animal, as you can see here, probably represented clan totems and might have been built to honor that creature and lay claim to a particular territory. Okay, so I have now taken you on a quick tour through the sites of Cahokia and Poverty Point, both of which are currently listed by UNESCO as having outstanding universal value. We've also discussed the sites on the United States tentative list for consideration by UNESCO, the Hopewellian earthworks and the Serpent Mound in Ohio. And what I want to emphasize is that together these sites represent over 3,000 years of mound building history. But even this remarkable range, 3,000 years, covers only about 1/2 of the tradition's time depth in North America. Recent research has recognized mounds going back to about 6,000 years, but few of these are well preserved enough to be considered for inscription on the UNESCO list. I sincerely hope this changes in the future as more sites are investigated, particularly as archaeologists gain access to dating mound sites that now sit on private property. So by way of conclusion, I also want to emphasize that just as the ancestral Pueblo traditions are carried on by the native people living at Taos Pueblo today, native groups whose homelands were or still are in what is now the eastern United States also continue the tradition of building and using mounds. So I have 3 examples up here. The top one is of a recent tribal building constructed in the shape of a mound on the tribal lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation in Oklahoma. In the bottom right here, we have the continued use of the ancient woodland period Nanawaya Mound by the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. And then on the left, we have a photograph of a ceremony being held by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians at the ancient Gadua Mound in North Carolina, where they have recently resumed the practice of building mounds by adding fill to an already constructed ancient mound. And all 3 of these instances, as well as many that I didn't put on the slide here, are clear indications of the ongoing importance of mounds and of mound building to contemporary Native people. The UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites does not yet acknowledge these communities at all or their ongoing traditions, but I believe it should. And the main reason that I believe this is that if it doesn't, we risk giving the impression that these communities have disappeared. So I hope that in the future, archaeologists will work together with cultural anthropologists and ethnographers to nominate some contemporary Native community in the eastern United States, or at least a community that was forcibly removed from the eastern United States, if it now exists in the West, to that UNESCO World Heritage List. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that we have. As Jen said, any of you that are here, you're welcome to walk up to the mic. I think there's one on both sides, so if you have any questions, do that. And then Tina is gonna take, I think, the questions for me from online. So if you're online, make sure to submit those and Tina will read them aloud.